Unit 23 Freedom Movement and Nationalist Literature. Structure 23.0 Objectives 23.1 Introduction 23.2 Literature in the 19th Century. Subsections of 23.2 23.2.1 Bengali 23.2.2 Gujarati 23.2.3 Hindi. Next section 23.3 Literature in the 20th Century. 23.4 Let us sum it up. 23.5 Key words. 23.6 Answers to check your progress exercises. 23.0 Objectives. In the previous blocks, you studied the spread of nationalist ideas throughout India through a series of political activities and movements. This unit informs you about the contribution of literature in this process. After reading this unit, you will: Point number 1. Become familiar with the literary contribution of the leading writers in various Indian languages. Point number 2. Understand the political content of these literary works. And point number 3. Learn the peculiar characteristics of this political content. Next section 23.1 Introduction. Literature played a significant role in the struggle for India's freedom. Beginning with the 19th century, when nationalist ideas began to emerge and literature in different Indian languages entered its modern phase, more and more writers began to employ literature for patriotic purpose. Most of them, in fact, believed that because they belonged to an enslaved country, it was their duty to create literature of a kind that would contribute to the all-round regeneration of their society and pave the way for national liberation. Even when freedom from the British rule had not yet emerged as a program of any major political organization or movement, and the Indian National Congress was concerned only with constitutional agitation, the realization of subjection and the need for freedom had begun to be clearly expressed in literature. With the passage of time, as the freedom movement began to attract larger sections of the people and the demand for freedom became more insistent, literature strengthened the growing idealism of the people. But it also did something more. Besides inspiring people to make all kinds of sacrifices for the cause of the country's liberation, literature also brought out the weaknesses of the nationalist movement and its leaders. In the following sections, we shall take a look at both of these aspects. Next section 23.2 Literature in the 19th Century. It will not be possible for us to consider literature in all the major Indian languages. For purposes of convenience, we shall confine ourselves mainly to three languages, namely Hindi, Gujarati, and Bengali. We shall notice that similar sentiments and ideas found manifestation in the literature of all three languages. This is a striking similarity that is reflected in the literature of all the Indian languages. And this shows a broad identity of sentiments and ideas in relation to the freedom movement all over the country. It was mainly during the latter half of the 19th century that political associations and national consciousness along modern lines emerged in different parts of the country. The foundation of the Indian National Congress in 1885, that is 1885, was, in a way, the culmination of these earlier developments. The literature produced during this period, as also later, was not only influenced by national consciousness, in turn, it also influenced the character and pattern of national consciousness. Subsection of 23.2. 23.2.1 Bengali. There are two towering figures in the annals of early modern Indian literature. They are Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyaya bracket 1838 to 94, that is 1838 to 94 bracket ends, and Govardhan Ram Madhavaram Tripathi bracket 1855 to 1907, that is 1855 to 1907. Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyaya, spelled as Bankimchandra, Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyaya, Chattopadhyaya, Chattopadhyaya. Govardhan Ram Madhavaram Tripathi, spelled as Govardhanram, Govardhan Ram. Madhavaram, spelled as Madhavaram. Tripathi, spelled as Tripathi. Besides being novelists, both of them were powerful intellectuals who made it their mission to understand the problems of their society and country. Their novels were intended to inspire their countrymen with patriotic sentiments. They, especially Bankim, also wrote essays that compelled their readers to think about the causes of the existing wretched state of their country. Bankim even brought out a journal, the Banga Darshan, that is spelled as Bangadarshan, the Banga Darshan, with a view to educating and inspiring as many of his countrymen as possible. His essays were often written in a humorous and sarcastic style that entertained the reader even as it compelled him or her to think. The combination of entertainment and education became even more effective in the novels. Though he wrote social novels also, it was largely through his historical romances that Bankim broadcast the message of patriotism. He combined history and fancy to create characters who were only too willing to make any sacrifice, even lay down their lives in their fight against injustice, oppression, and subjection. This combination became particularly effective in the Anandamath bracket 1882, that is 1882. Anandamath, spelt as Anandamath. With its celebrated song Vande Mataram, the Anandamath inspired generations of patriots, and the revolutionaries truly treated it as their gospel. There was, however, a kind of pro Hindu bias in Bankim's conception of nationalism. This even assumed the form of an anti Muslim feeling when, as in the Anandamath, the fight shown was against Muslim oppressors. This aspect of Bankim's nationalism has been the subject of serious scholarly debate. Let us avoid the details here. What is important for us is the context to realize that the kind of bias we notice in Bankim is not confined to him alone, nor is it confined to that group of patriots or nationalists whom our textbooks describe as revivalists or religious nationalists. This is a bias which more or less is reflected in a cross section of nationalists. We may also note that this bias is not part of the dominant ideology of Indian nationalism that emerged during the latter 19th century. In other words, while an anti Muslim bias got betrayed time and again, it was not consciously put forward as a part of the nationalist ideology. We cannot think of a more convincing example than that of R.C. Dutt bracket 1848 to 1909 bracket ends, that is 1848 to 1909 bracket ends, remembered as one of the pioneers of what is described as the economic nationalism for his powerful exposure of the country's exploitation under British rule. That was heavily westernized in his dress, habits, and thoughts. This was only natural in view of his position as a member of Indian civil service, which was virtually monopolized by Britishers. But despite his westernization, Dutt remained a Hindu who admired and respected his traditions and culture. It is this aspect of his personality that led him, the author of the Economic History of India, to write the history of civilization in ancient India and translate the Rig Veda, Ramayana, and Mahabharata. This he was prompted to do by what he termed his literary patriotism. The same literary patriotism influenced the choice of his first four novels, all of which are historical romances. Today, the role of Dutt's literary writings in the development of Indian nationalism may have been forgotten, but in his own lifetime and a little later also, these inspired people in Bengal and other parts of the country as much as did his economic writings. There is, thus, a cultural component of Dutt's economic nationalism. In fact, the very distinction between cultural nationalism and economic nationalism is an artificial and arbitrary distinction. Indian nationalism, like nationalism in other parts of the world, was a comprehensive force that appealed to people at more than one plane. It appealed to their idealism as also to their material interests. In the process, it affected different aspects of their life as social beings, as members of a professional group or economic class, as members of a caste, sect, or religion, as members of a linguistic group or region, as man or woman. Coming back to Dutt's historical novels or romances, there is a betrayed in these a pronounced anti Muslim bias. It seems that with the passage of time, Dutt came to realize the political dangers of a conception of nationalism in which part of India's past was remembered that entailed a confrontation between Hindus and Muslims. For later on, he moved away from historical novels of this kind and concentrated on social novels. It is significant to note that, in spite of such a realization, when he idealized the ancient Indian past in his social novel Samaj, bracket 1893, that is 1893 bracket closes, he self consciously revealed a conception of Indian nationalism in which Hindus were seen as key figures. But to say this is not to suggest that Dutt was a communalist. What his example is meant to highlight is the fact that, given the circumstances of latter 19th century colonial India, Indian nationalism necessarily contained undertones that were capable of emerging as a result of other politico economic factors as communal tendencies. It means that even the greatest of the creative writers should not be seen as individual figures. They should rather be understood as representative figures who gave expression to the underlying forces and tendencies of their times. Hence, the element of similarity in otherwise such dissimilar personalities as Bankim and R.C. Dutt. We have dwelt on this aspect of Indian nationalism at some length because it becomes visible to us only at when we seek to understand it in terms of contemporary literature. It is an aspect that does not correspond to the standard textbook picture of Indian nationalism, where it is neatly divided into secular and communal bracket or religious bracket closes, economic and cultural, and moderate and extremist. There is reason to modify the stereotype image of Indian nationalism and to see it as an integrated, though complex, whole.
The book is Nationalism, the Later War Years 2, Unit 23, Freedom Movement and Nationalist Literature. Topic 23.2.2 Gujarati. Let us now turn to Govardhan Ram Tripathi, one of the makers of modern Gujarati literature, who wrote the four parts of his famous novel Saraswati Chandra, Sarasvatichandra, Saraswati Chandra, over a period of no less than 14 years, 14 years, 1887 to 1901. Designed as an epic in prose and written professedly to inspire and educate the reading classes of Gujarat about the destiny of their country, Saraswati Chandra deals with the multifaceted problems of India in bondage and lays down possible lines of action for patriotically inclined Indians. It laments the loss of India's independence. At the same time, however, it welcomes the fact that of all the nations, it is the British who are ruling over this country. With their inherent sense of justice and love of democracy, they would prepare India for self rule. While Govardhan Ram placed trust in British justice, he also emphasized that if the Indians did not look after their own interests, even the British would feel tempted to completely neglect their welfare. We may today find it strange that Indians should have trusted the British like this. Still, this faith was an essential part of the Indian attitude towards the colonial connection. In fact, it was even related to the will of God, who, it was argued, had placed India under British tutelage. Tutelage, tutelage. In a way, most of us share this attitude when we trace, to give just one example, the making of modern India to the influences released by the British rulers, particularly English education. Ironically enough, even the emergence of Indian nationalism is seen to a large extent as a product of Western influences. This being the case, we should not find it difficult to understand why the early Indian nationalists welcomed British rule, although they were not blind to its exploitative aspect. Exploitative aspect. We may do well at this stage in our discussion to follow the reflection of this dual attitude towards British rule in later 19th century Indian literature. Let us begin with a very perceptive statement made by Vishnu Krishna Chiplankar, Chiplunkar, Chiplankar, 1850 to 82. Commenting on British rule, he wrote in his Nibandhamala, 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 about the way English educated Indians had been affected by it. Crushed by English poetry, our freedom has been destroyed. In this comment, English poetry stands for English education and all those intellectual influences by means of which the faith was instilled among Indians that British rule was for their welfare and the result of divine dispensation. Chiplankar had the insight to understand this subtle and invisible dimension of the British hold over India. So powerful, indeed, was this hold that in spite of his own insight, Chiplankar himself subscribed to the divine dispensation theory and enumerated the advantages that India was deriving as a result of the British colonial connection. Significantly enough, he did this in the very essay in which he had talked of the destruction of India's freedom by English poetry. Considering that the insight offered by Chiplankar more than 100 years ago does not come to us easily even today when we are celebrating the 40 years of our independence, it is in order to further illustrate the point about the dual paradoxical paradoxical attitude of Indian towards British rule. This is end of topic 23.2.2 and end of this recording. I shall continue with 23.2.3 in the next recording. Page 8. Book Nationalism, the Later War Years 2, Unit 23, Freedom Movement and Nationalist Literature, Topic 23.2.3, Hindi. We shall now move on to Hindi literature and refer to Bharathendu Harishchandra, Bharathendu, Bharathendu, Harishchandra, Harishchandra, Handra, Harishchandra, 1850 to 1885, who was largely instrumental in ushering the modern phase of Hindi literature. Despite his early death, Bharathendu produced a vast mass of literature and wrote in a variety of forms such as poetry, drama, and essays. He also brought out a number of journals in order to enlighten the people about the affairs of their country and society. A large portion of Bharathendu's literature is concerned with the question of subjection. For example, in a public lecture on the promotion of Hindi, 1877, he asked the people the following poignant question: how come, as human beings, we became slaves and they, the British, kings? This was a question that touched the very essence of India's political situation and did so in such a simple and moving manner that even the most ordinary men and women could understand it. This, however, was a question that could drive among people a feeling of importance in the face of their all powerful kings. Bharathendu consequently inspired them with yet another question which was intended to remove their despair. How long, he asked, would you suffer these sorrows as slaves? He went on in his lecture to warn against the paralyzing tendency of depending on foreigners for the country's salvation. He spurred the people on to set aside their fear and mutual differences and to stand up to uphold the dignity of their language, religion, culture, and country. This lecture, it may be mentioned, was delivered in the form of very simple couplets that could touch the very core of their listeners and readers. Bharathendu thus employed poetry to carry to the people the message of patriotism. He even used popular and conventional poetic and other literary forms for the purpose. For example, he wrote bhajans that were intended to describe the state of the country. In this manner, he could enlarge the field of his appeal and message. He also advised his contemporaries to make use of popular literary forms. This, it may be noted, was a development that reached its climax during the heyday of the freedom movement, when popular songs were composed and sung during Prabhat Peris. P-R-A-B-H-A-T, Prabhat, P-H-E-R-I-E-S, Peris, Prabhat Peris, and public rallies. Many of these songs the British Indian government was forced to proscribe through, though without much success. One advantage of such compositions was that the reality of foreign rule could be brought out in an idiom that even the illiterate millions could immediately grasp and feel inspired by. Not understanding of the intricacies of political economy, with its theories of imperialism, 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 was required to know that the British presence in India meant. To give just a couple of examples, we know that drain of wealth constituted an important item in the nationalist critique of British rule. It was a theme that generated a fierce controversy, and the controversy was often conducted in a language and with the help of facts and figures that were by no means easy to grasp. And yet, drain became in course of time something that the people had little difficulty in understanding. In the popularization of the word drain, a significant part was played by literature. Thus, in his public lecture on the promotion of Hindi, Bharatendu singled out drain as the chief evil of foreign rule. In fact, the very reason why foreign rule existed and said in everyday language. People here have been fooled by the power and trickeries of the machine. Every day they are losing their wealth and their distress is increasing. Unable to do without foreign cloth, they have become the slaves of foreign weavers. Bharatendu uses the single term foreign weavers to denote the powerful industrial interests in Manchester and relates the deeper forces of imperialism with the life around common men and women in subject India. He translates into everyday consciousness the two symbols, Manchester and the word drain, of the exploitative relationship between British and India. Thus, he could bring out the stark reality of this relationship in a mukari, 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 which is a conventional poetic form containing only 4 lines. In what strikingly enough he described as a mukri for modern times, Bharatendu provided the following description of drain. Secretly sucking the whole juice from within, smilingly grasping the body, heart and wealth. So generous in making promises, O friend, is it your husband? No, the Englishman. Reading the mukari again. Secretly sucking the whole juice from within, smilingly grasping the body, heart and wealth. So generous in making promises. O friend, is it your husband? No, the Englishman. The choice of popular forms was not confined to poetry alone. In some of his plays too, Bharatendu made use of conventional and well-known forms and stories. For example, his Andher Nagari Chaupat Raja uses a popular a tale that was in common circulation in different parts of the country, to bring out the arbitrary and oppressive character of British rule. While the political message is clearly conveyed, the reader all along is entertained. Humor is effectively utilized for political ends. As for humor, Bharatendu managed to entertain his readers even in otherwise serious writings. In the Bharat Durdasha, 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 1880, 1880, which is his most directly political play, Bharathendu introduces a number of funny sequences or sentences. This is the end of recording for topic 23.2.3 Hindi, page 9. Book Nationalism, the Later War Years 2, Unit 23, Freedom Movement and Nationalist Literature. This is part 2 of topic 23.2.3 Hindi, starting in page 11. What Bharathendu said about the country's subjection in his lecture on the promotion of Hindi recurs again and again in many of his writings. But this is often accompanied by generous praise for British rule. Thus, his Bharat Durdasha, despite its strong patriotic thrust, accepts that with the establishment of British rule, the regeneration of the country has been facilitated. Similarly, in the Bharat Janani, written in 1877, another of his political plays, Bharathendu admits that if the British had not come to administer India, the country's ruin would have gone on uninterrupted. It may be stressed that this duality of attitude towards the British connection is not peculiar to Chiplankar or Bharathendu. They are merely examples meant to indicate the general pattern of the educated Indian response to the West in general and British rule in particular. With the passage of time, the realization of subjection and its disastrous consequences tended to become dominant, and the appreciation of the boons offered by the British began to decline. But until the last, Indians could not shed off the tendency to admire aspects of the British connection. As we noted earlier, the tendency persists in our own day. Now check your progress. First main. Which of the following statements are right or wrong? Question 1. The need for freedom was expressed in literature earlier than the political organizations. Question 2. There was a pro-Hindu bias in Bankim Chandra's historical novels. Third one. Bharathendu Harishchandra praised the British in his writing. Fourth one, the 19th century literature adopted a dual approach towards the British rule. Now, second main, answer the following questions. First one, who brought out the journal Bangadarshan, Bangadarshan, Bangadarshan. Question 2. Which year did Bankim write Anand Math? Anandmath. Anand Math. Third question. Who is remembered as a pioneer of economic nationalism? Question 4. Who wrote the play Ander Nagari Chaupat Raja? Third main, match the following as in the text. Column A has the following options. A. Anand Mat, B. Bharat Durdasha, C. R.C. Dutt, D. Bharatendu Harishchandra. Column B has the following options. A. Literary patriotism, B. Mukari, C. Political play, D. Historical romance. This ends the recording for topic 23.2.3 in page 11.
Nationalism, the Interwar Years 2, page number 11, Literature in the 20th Century. Until about the First World War 1914 to 1918 and the Russian Revolution 1917, the general trend of the discussion of freedom and subjection followed, by and large, the pattern that had emerged during the later decades of the 19th century. Freedom was seen as the natural condition to which any people should aspire. India could not be an exception to this. Instead of specific grievances and specific concessions, an integrated critique of the British rule evolved over the years, and freedom seemed the only solution. What this freedom would mean in concrete terms, however, did not become the dominant theme of discussion during this long phase. It is not that issues like poverty and exploitation within the Indian society, as against the exploitation by the British, did not figure in Indian literature between 1914 to 1918 war. The often did Indian literature of this period offers many examples of moving descriptions of the poverty of peasants. Perhaps the most outstanding of these examples is provided by Chamman Athaguntha 1897, Six Bighas of Land, a novel by Fakir Mohan Senapati, one of the makers of modern Oriya literature. These moving descriptions are at times accompanied by radical statements in relation to the existing pattern of social organization. For example, Radhacharan Goswami, 1859 to 1923, a leading Hindi writer, was moved by rural poverty to suggest as early as 1883 that land should not belong to the government or the zamindar, but to the peasant who tilled it. Such radicalism, however, remained confined to sentiments. It was not presented as part of a carefully worked out plan of social reorganization, nor was it integrated with the question of national freedom. Besides economic inequality and exploitation within the Indian society, the social inequality and oppression based on caste was also discussed at times. But this too remained more a sentimental issue. After the First World War, however, the situation changed fairly rapidly. The issue no longer was simply whether India should become free. That had to be ensured at any cost. The real point of debate now tended to relate to the actual content and meaning of freedom. Freedom for whom? Surely, freedom could not merely mean the replacement of British with Indian masters. As Roopmati, a character in Premchand's short story Ahuti, says, I quote, Swaraj does not mean that Govind sits in John's place. Unquote. She asks, will the same evils, for the removal of which we are exposing our lives to danger, be welcomed simply because those evils have turned Swadeshi and are no longer Videshi? Unquote. Her preference is clear. Quote, if even after Swaraj is attained, unquote, she says, quote, property enjoys the same power and the educated people remain as selfish as before, then I would rather not have Swaraj. Unquote. Indian literature during the last 30 years of the freedom struggle became increasingly concerned with the momentous question of the objectives freedom was expected to serve. It consequently turned more and more to the ideological 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 dimension of the freedom struggle. In the process, it not only debated the nature of free India but also closely followed the character of the freedom movement. After all, it could not turn a blind eye to the ideals and reality of the movement, with its divisions and leaders, if it cared to bring about a certain kind of society after the country had won independence. If the programs, ideals, and leaders of the movement were not of the right kind, it was impossible to have the desired type of free India. The significance of this concern is highlighted by the following comment in Premchand's novel Gaban, 1931. Devi Deen, an ordinary man with marked nationalist sympathies, tells the leaders, quote, if you run after luxuries, even when you are not in power, you will eat away the people when it is your rule. Unquote. The work of Premchand, 1880 to 1936, the great Hindi Urdu novelist and a confirmed nationalist, amply illustrates the anxiety about the disturbing side of the nationalist struggle. In two of his major novels, Rangabhumi, 1925 and Karmabhumi, 1932, the underlying selfishness of the educated nationalist leaders is clearly exposed. But this is a selfishness that is disguised with humanism and radicalism. It is so well disguised that these leaders themselves delude themselves that everything they are doing is in the interest of the country and the people, even their compromises and secret dealings with the rulers are in the interest of the nationalist movement. But the most depressing view and one of the greatest But the most depressing view of nationalist politics is provided in Godan, 1936, which is Premchand's masterpiece and one of the greatest Indian novels. In Rangabhumi and Karmabhumi, the national characters, with all their failings, finally emerge as martyrs. They realize their weaknesses and make proper amends. As for Rangabhumi, its blind hero Surdas, who is cast in the mold of Mahatma Gandhi, represents an aspect of nationalist politics and leadership for which Premchand has been but respect and administration. Godan offers no such redeeming features. Through at least three characters, Rai Sahab, Khanna and Pandit Om Karnath, it shows the people for money and petty material considerations in nationalist politics. Rai Sahab, a rich zamindar, joins the satyagraha and then joins back to the politics of the Legislative Council and unscrupulously UN Scrupulously, unscrupulously, uses money in the bargain. Similarly, Khanna, who is a banker, businessman, and petty industrialist rolled into one, does his bit during the civil disobedience movement and after that starts making money by means that are more foul than fair. And Omkar Nath is a journalist who can breathe fire in his editorials. But this fire breathing nationalist is basically a self seeker for whom nationalism is a matter of self promotion. Exploitation being its basic theme, Godan portrays a sad and cheerless world. Here, Premchand is not carried away by sentimentalism. He does not offer any easy solutions. The villains in Godan do not suddenly undergo a change of heart. In fact, there are no villains in this novel. It is not the wickedness of individuals that leads them to oppress and exploit their poorer fellow human beings. Exploitation is the result of certain socio-economic and political arrangements within the society. The oppressed classes will not have a better deal if those belonging to the dominant classes are individually good and kind persons. Rai Sahab, himself a kind hearted zamindar, has understood this when he says, quote, I cannot set aside my self interest. Unquote. He adds, quote, I want that my class should be forced to give up its selfishness and through the pressure of the administration and morality. Unquote. What naturally Rai Sahab cannot see is that the real solution is not to bring pressure upon his class, the zamindars, but to abolish the class and make every kisan a zamindar. The whole logic of Godan points towards this solution. Although a powerful work of fiction, it does not prescribe solutions. What Godan further shows is that zamindars, as an exploiting class, do not exist in isolation. They are, in reality, part of a vast and complex network of exploitation in which businessmen, industrialists, and zamindars together have a vested interest. Of course, this network is supported by the existing political order. It is not that there are no antagonism. Antagonisms. Antagonisms among these various moneyed interests. But despite their clashes, they possess the sense to put up a joint front against those who threaten their supremacy. That is how the peasants and workers continue to be oppressed and exploited.
This is Janaki Narayan for UPSC. Unit 23, Freedom Movement and Nationalist Literature. 23.3, Literature in the 20th Century Continued. Textbook page number 1414. Godan thus brings out in all its intricacy the duality of class and nation. Freedom for the nation is essential, but it should not be the freedom of the dominant classes to exploit the wretched of the society. Nationalism should not be permitted to disguise, in the name of patriotic idealism, the interests of the few at the expense of the many. In the understanding of the duality of class and nation, the growing influence of socialist ideas in the wake of the Russian Revolution performed an important function. Thus, In Premashrama, a novel that he started writing in the year after the Russian Revolution, Premchand showed Balraj, an angry young villager, being inspired by the example of Russia. Calling upon his fellow villagers to fight against injustice and oppression, Balraj tells them that in Russia, the cultivators have become the rulers. While the duality between class and nation was seen, it was not easy to understand how the duality could be resolved. Considering that India was struggling against a firmly entrenched imperialist power, a unified front of all the classes within the Indian society had to be forged. And this meant at least some compromise with vested interests. Moreover, there was also the question of ideological preferences. If the influence of socialist ideas suggested the way of class interests being resolved by conflict, Gandhian influence pointed towards trusteeship and change of heart. If Prem Chand's work is representative of his times, as indeed it is, no clear ideological choices could be made during the freedom struggle. For example, when he was writing Godan, a novel that showed the futility, futility of relying on individual goodness and change of heart, Premchand wrote a letter that goes against the very logic of this great novel. Revolution, he said, is the failure of saner methods. It is the people's character that is the deciding factor. No social system can flourish until we are individually uplifted. What fate a revolution may lead us to is doubtful. It may lead us to worse forms of dictatorship, denying all personal liberty. I do want to overhaul, but not to destroy. Like most of his educated contemporaries, Premchand felt torn between two opposing ideological positions without having been able to make up his mind one way or the other. It may be noticed in this context that many scholars have tried to argue that after the initial Gandhian influence, Premchand was finally able to opt for a radical progressive position. I'll repeat that. Premchand was able to finally opt for a radical progressive position. As against these scholars, there are others who maintain that until the end, Premchand remained a Gandhian. Both these attempts simplify a complex historical situation. By way of confirmation, we may offer the example of the literature produced by the Kallol group in Bengal, Kallol, Kallol group in Bengal, a group that had among its members the famous radical nationalist poet Qazi Nazarul Islam. Progressive and realistic, these writers consciously moved away from the life of the privileged sections of society and wrote about the oppressed and the deprived. They raised the cry of revolt much more vocally than Premchand. And yet, they remained bound to the hidden pulls of their own social background and failed to present a clear cut ideological position. Also important in this context is the example of Sharat Chandra Chattopadhyaya, 1876 to 1938, the famous Bengali novelist who wrote so feelingly and realistically about the cheerless existence of women and questioned some of the cherished values of middle class society. Like Premchand, Sharat Chandra's sympathies were with the Congress. He admired Gandhi and had close personal relations with Deshbandhu Chittaranjan Das. Unlike Premchand, Sharat Chandra was even a member of the Congress. And yet he wrote Pater Dabi in 1926. I'll spell it out: Pather, Pater, Dabi, Dabi, in 1926. A novel that idealized those who followed the path of revolutionary violence to liberate the country. The novel, it may be noted, was banned by the government. This contradiction is striking enough. An admirer of Gandhi and a member of the Congress praising the path of violence. Sharat Chandra shows further contradiction with regard to his political position. Between 1929 and 1931 was serialized his Bipradas. I'll spell it Bipradas, Bipradas. These were the years when the Congress adopted Purna Swaraj as its goal and launched the civil disobedience movement. Written during these dramatic years, Bipradas presents the picture of a zamindar who is worshipped by his Rayat, 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 to such an extent that they, the Rayat, refused to respond to the appeals of the nationalists. Reflecting these diametrically opposite pulls, literature should persuade us to have a new look at the making of our recent history. It should convince us of the need to go deeper than the carefully formulated programs and pronouncements of political parties and other organizations. For beneath these consciously stated positions lay pulls and prejudices of which people were not always conscious. Thus, it happened that the author of Godan was himself not fully aware of the revolutionary logic of his novel. For otherwise, he could not have so empathetically argued against the idea of revolution in the letter that we have already mentioned. Thus, again, it happened that when the Progressive Writers Association was formed, in order to promote progressive ideas through literature, Premchand was requested to preside at its first session, 1936, although, as we have seen, he was unwilling to support the idea of class war. It is not sound history to assume that because Premchand presided over the first session of the Progressive Writers Association, he must have been nothing but progressive. And what applies to individuals? In this case, Premchand applies to movements also. For no movement can be independent of its members. It can lay down neat principles and objectives. It can also isolate itself formally from other movements and organizations in the society. But it cannot ensure that its followers actually share in their entirety its principles and objectives. The individuals constituting a movement remain exposed to other influences as well. I am on page 15 now. I'll be continuing in the next audio. For UPSC, Janaki, Unit 23, Freedom Movement and Nationalist Literature, 23.3, Literature in the 20th Century Continued. Textbook page number 15, PDF page 54. Literature of the last 30 years of the freedom struggle tells us that during these momentous years, people were increasingly becoming aware of socio-economic issues even as they were being fired by the zeal for independence. They were coming under the influence of different, even opposing ideological currents. In fact, they did not always realize the contradictory nature of these ideological positions. We have dwelt at length on Premchand because both in his life and in his writings, we are able to follow the working of these contradictory influences and the inability of even the most sensitive and intelligent of men and women to make a clear choice. If Premchand, like most of his contemporaries, reveals both Gandhian and socialist influences, if he paints a dismal picture of the nationalist movement and also provides stirring accounts of the same movement, the task of the historian is not to assume that only one of these conflicting positions can be the real position. Instead, historians should see the conflicting positions as forming parts of a complex whole. Of course, they should see in these unresolved ideological conflicts the working of socio-economic forces as well. As is clear from the description in Karma Bhumi, Rangabhumi and Godan, contemporary literature provides the historian with insights for seeing the dialectical, dialectical, dialectical operation of ideology and material interests. For understanding the complex interplay of forces that went into the making of our freedom struggle, we may turn probably to the pre-1947 writings of the great Bengali novelist Tara Shankar Bandyopadhyay, 1898 to 1971, especially his Dhatri Devata, Dhatri Dhatri Devata, Gana Devata, Ganadevata, Vata, Ganadevata, and Panchagram, Panchagram, Panchagram. Datri Devata is a semi autobiographical novel and may be seen as a kind of preparation for Gana Devata and Panchagram, which are in reality one novel in two parts. Possessing typical dimensions, Gana Devata and Panchagram have as their central theme this disintegration of village society under the impact of exploitation and industrialization. Tara Shankar is not interested in individuals. His concern is the community, the people. Naturally, the freedom movement too affects the life of the community. The Congress, the Muslim League, and the revolutionaries appear on the scene, the first two more than the third. We get a view of larger historical forces from below. Idealism, power, material interests are mixed in different proportions as they affect the destiny of the people in the 5 villages that provide the locales of Ganadevata and Panchagram. However, just as Godan with its 2 villages and Rangabhumi with just 1 village deal with the tragic fate of rural society as a whole, through these 5 villages, Tara Shankar tells us at great length and with acute sensitivity about India during the freedom struggle from the vantage point of the deprived and the dispossessed in her villages. With all his sensitivity and objectivity, however, Tara Shankar betrays in these 3 novels the kind of ideological flux that we have been talking about. He writes very feelingly about the growing burden of oppression on the poorer section of the village society. He also describes their struggles against this oppression, a struggle that is doomed to fail, not only because of the power of the dominant groups, but also because of the larger reality of industrialization against which the village community life and economy simply cannot survive. But this unmistakable sympathy for the poor and the oppressed is accompanied by an equally unmistakable sympathy for the culture that was associated with the order that is now disintegrating. In other words, Tara Shankar reveals in these novels the coexistence of an implicit ideological radicalism with an implicitly social conservatism. Conservatism, conservatism. It is not that contemporary literature does not provide instances of works in which clear ideological choices are shown. No less a literary giant than Rabindranath Tagore, 1861 to 1941, condemned revolutionary violence in the clearest possible terms in his novel Char Adhyay, Charadhyay in 1934. But then Tagore was not at his creative best in this novel. He was, if anything, writing a sort of political manifesto in the form of fiction. Similarly, Ramanlal Vasantlal Desai, 1892 to 1951, perhaps the most popular Gujarati novelist of the period, showed in his Divya Chakshu, Divyachaksu, Divya Chakshu, Divya Chakshu 1932, the complete conversion of its revolutionary hero Arjun from faith in violence to the Gandhian path. But like Char Adhyay, Divya Chakshu cannot be treated as a representative work. Moreover, unlike Tagore, Ramanlal Desai was by no means a novelist who would unravel the complexities of life and society. A more representative figure in contemporary Gujarati literature can be seen in K. M. Munshi, who was born 5 years before Ramanlal Desai and survived him much longer in independent India. A leading lawyer and literary writer, Munshi was also a member of the Congress. In his capacity as a prominent Congress leader, he subscribed to a secular ideology. But virtually the whole of his work as a novelist not only invokes a glorious Hindu past, but also promotes a Hindu conception of Indian nationalism. This ends the text. Now I will read the questions. Check your progress too. Read the following statements and mark right or wrong. Literature in India was able to spell out in concrete terms various dimensions of independence. That is one. Two, Godan was concerned only with the question of independence. 3. Premashrama was inspired by the example of the Russian Revolution. 4. Although Sarat Chandra Chattopadhyay admired Gandhi, yet at times idealized those who believed in revolutionary violence. Question number 2. Write 10 lines on the political contribution of Prem Chand literary works. Question number 3. Match the following. I will first read column 1, then I will read column 2. In column 1, 1A, Chaman Atagunta. 2B, Karma Bhumi. 3C, Vipradas. 4D, Gana Devata. Now I will read column 2. A. Sarat Chandra Chattopadhyay. B. Tara Shankar Bandopadhyay. C. Fakir Mohan Senapati. D. Premchand. 23.4. Let us sum up. We have in this brief sketch of Indian literature during the freedom struggle deliberately dealt with those aspects of the freedom movement which force us to move away from neat categories in order to understand it. What we have said about the freedom movement, the constant interplay of contradictory forces, holds true about the making of modern Indian society as a whole. To put it simply, it is not that one person or group is secular, progressive, and nationalist, while another person or group is reactionary and communal. Society and the people living in it are too complex to permit such a neat classification. This is a lesson that literature teaches us best. Historians and other social scientists may do well to learn this lesson. 23.5 key words. Historical romance, a work of fiction placed in historical setting. Religious nationalists, those who received inspiration for their patriotism from their religion. Literary patriotism, using literature for expressing patriotic ideas. Economic nationalism, an attempt undertaken by the 19th century leaders and intellectuals to establish the economic roots of Indian nationalism by preparing an economic critique of the British rule.
Title: Modern Indian History, period 1857 to 1947. Unit 20: The Non-Brahmin Movement in Western and Southern India. 23.4. Let's sum it up. We have, in this brief sketch of Indian literature during the freedom struggle, deliberately dealt with those aspects of the freedom movement which force us to move away from neat categories in order to understand it. What we have said about the freedom movement, the constant interplay of contradictory forces, CONTRADICTORY, contradictory forces, holds true about the making of modern Indian society as a whole. To put it simply, it is not that one person or group is secular, progressive, PROGRESSIVE, and nationalist, while another person or group is reactionary, REACTIONARY, and communal. Society and the people living in it are too complex to permit such neat classifications. This is a lesson that literature teaches us best. Historians and other social scientists may do well to learn this lesson. Unit 23.5, Key Words. Historical romance is a work of fiction placed in a historical setting. Religious nationalists are those who received inspiration for their patriotism from their religion. Literary patriotism is using literature for expressing patriotic ideas. Economic nationalism is an attempt undertaken by the 19th century leaders and intellectuals to establish the economic roots of Indian nationalism by preparing an economic critique, CRITIQUE, economic critique of the British rule. Unit 23.6, Answers to check your progress exercises. Check your progress 1. The first question, 1 is correct, 2 is correct, 3 is wrong, 4 is correct. Second part, first one, Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay. Second one, 1882. Third, R.C. Dutt. Fourth, Bhartendu Harishchandra. Now the third question, I think it is a match the following. So 1 is A to D, 2 is B to C, 3 is C to A, and 4 is D to B. Now check your progress 2. First part, 1 is wrong, 2 is wrong, 3 is correct, 4 is correct. The second part, your answer should refer to A. The emphasis that Premchand laid on freedom struggle in his literary works. B. Some of the political choices and statements made by the characters in his novels. And C. His own political, ideological learnings. Ideological spelling is Ideological. The third part, 1 is A to C, second is B to D, third is C to A, and fourth is D to B.